Hello, everyone. I'm Yahya Gamal. I'll be moderating the session. Thank you for tuning in for the ECTQG. This session is themed as energy and industry. So a couple of timekeeping things to mention here. First, we have 4 presentations. Each presentation will have 20 minutes. And we will be taking the questions and answers at the end of the session after all the presentations. Just please note that this session is recorded, so if you wish that the recording of your presentation is not published on YouTube through our YouTube channel, just please let us know and we will abide to that. And can also ask us at any point to pause the recording if you wish to. So I think we'll start with the first presentation by Fernando Benitez and Mark Birkin. And they already started sharing the screen. So the floor is yours, Fernando.
Thank you very much for this kind of presentation. So my name is Fernando Benitez. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a research associate in the Alan Turing Institute. And I'm working with Professor Mark Birkin from University of Leeds and also from the Alan Turing Institute in the Urban Analytics team. But I'm also supporting the special modeling work package in shock and resilience project in the Institute. Thank you very much, as I said, for having me here today. This presentation describes the ideas we have been exploring in the study of social inequalities in urban energy use, in particular in the UK landscape. But before jumping into the topic, just a quick heads up. This is still work in progress. We are still in the preliminary stage of the research of our project, where we are integrating the data, trying to get more understanding of the science behind the foundation of the idea, and getting feedbacks or questions from a larger audience will definitely will be useful for our road ahead that we have. So we really appreciate any comments, critique, or suggestions that this approach might have, maybe you have identified. So it's quite relevant for us at this particular moment. So if you have any suggestions, all of them are very welcome for us. So let's start. And just to make sure, can you see my screen, right?
Yes, you can see your screen and we can hear you clearly.
Okay.
You can.
Thank you. So a couple of slides to give you an idea about what we think is why this topic is relevant. So I will start with the main concept in here, inequality. So this is a very popular concept, and it is actually a big issue that has been studied for a long time. There are all kinds of perspectives that study inequalities, from income inequality to health access, racial inequality, or gender economic inequality. Wherever one thing this pandemic has taught us is how unequal our cities can be. So in fact, despite of 90% of the world's GDP arise from urban activities, the distribution is very uneven. So during the previous lockdown, we see a lot of communities being forced to stay at home, causing a huge disruption of their lives. So we could see some people were dramatic effects in terms of access to health systems or having financial issues due to the lockdowns. And in parallel, countries or cities have been responding at different levels to support those who need more help. But we could see also weak responses, weak policies, responses to this pandemic, and how this has led for further widening of economic, racial, and gender divides. So as people was forced to stay at home and run their activities, at least those who were able to do it, their energy also increased. Therefore, the cost that they have to pay for that also increased. So although this is an issue, this is a new issue, cities like New York or Boston have recently started to evaluate social inequality in energy use to inform more equitable distribution of energy-related investments. So the pandemic has forced us to understand a little bit better how the energy use is being distributed, not only how we can understand the energy demand, which is quite a popular topic, and there are several kind of methods to understand these energy demands, and actually is basically the data what we can get, but the energy use and what kind of the actions we can take to equally distribute any energy efficiency policies or strategies is one of the topics that inspires this project. The second aspects or the other perspective that is being taken to define this project is basically the global energy demand. So this is another perspective. This is like an additional perspective of the energy demand and our long way to make our cities more sustainable, but also to guarantee that the ongoing strategies are equally distributed. So previously I described why we think social inequality is relevant, why is relevant, but why we should focus in social inequality in energy use. Well, if I reflect, if we reflect on the global energy demand, broadly speaking, the global energy demand for energy can be split into three main sectors, each accounting for roughly a third of the energy demand. So we have a transportation sector, which is the worst offering sector with nearly 90% of all demand covered by non-renewable energy sources. Then we have the second sector, which is the industrial or agriculture, which accounts for 35% of the global demand. And over 80% of the energy use comes from not renewable sources. Finally, buildings with the 33% of the global demands use over 86% of the energy demand, especially for heating. Just from that range, just the 30.6% use modern renewable sources, as you can see from these renewable global status reports. That recent report that we just got came out. Therefore, getting more knowledge about how the energy demand and the use, actually not only the demand, the use of this energy is especially distributed in the country, in the UK, might also help us to reshape the current efficiency and conservation programs. So this is an approach that we start to explore to integrate two main areas in our group. Initially, the study of the crisis in urban places, how society is adapting to future shocks, in particular, the consequence of those crises leading to increased levels of inequality in urban places, where historically, as I mentioned before, the inequality was notorious. The current pandemic is perhaps the most noticeable crisis, and it has been studied mostly from health perspective, for instance, health access inequality. But I believe that there are other nuances that we can study from this crisis, especially linked with the climate change challenge that we all are dealing at this particular moment. Carbon mitigation strategies and the city seeking to understand the quality in residential low carbon energy efficiency and conservation progress is also another aspects that we consider give us another perspective, not only in terms of health perspective or the COVID issue that we are dealing right now. Just to give you an instance, what we can understand how the special distribution of the heat pumps. I'm sure that maybe some of you have read in some of the newspaper that we recently, well, not recently, it was in April, there is a grant to provide different household owners with £5,000 available from the last April. And one of the ways to bring the price closer to the installing of new gas boiler. So currently heating accounts for 21% of the UK carbon emissions, and no new gas boilers will be sold after 2035. So although to 25 million of UK homes have gas boilers, the grant only will fund just nearly 90,000 pumps over 3 years. So of course, there are several critics about this approach, and they have pointed out that the needs for this cost of new isolations or other home improvements to help households to get a better odds of most of the switch is also one way. I mean, it's quite positive that the government is trying to encourage this reduction or provide this grant, but this is not the only way. Perhaps it's also really important how we can support the current household holders to find another ways to reshape or modify their house to properly isolate their home, and also find different financial supports for access to this new technology or new elements that help us to move through these low carbon isolation programs like these heat pumps. In general, if we combine the study of inequality and the consequence from the big crisis like the current that we have with climate change actions and carbon mitigation programs, we think that there is an interesting gap in these projects that we are attempting to cover. Initially, a combination of multiple data sources, the inequality landscapes in energy use in relationship with income and other social dependencies to better understand inequality might help us to understand the urban policies to shape more equal energy efficiency and conservation progress. Of course, this is not the first step to understand the fairness in allocation resources. First, also, we need to identify whether or not there is any inequality in energy use, and then we need metrics to measure it, and then evaluate how the income or social determinants like ethnicity might be another driving factors. So, as I said, we think combining both approaches, we have an interesting approach to cover here. So how we are going to estimate the social inequality in energy use? Well, initially, we need to estimate the energy consumption and the energy use intensity. And essentially, the energy use intensity express a building's energy use as a function of heat size or other characteristics. And this is a very complicated data challenge, essentially because the data that we needed at the scale that we needed is not available for define or to understand the special disparities that we have in energy use. Most of the data, or mostly the data available, comes from aggregator levels or aggregator sources. The existing literature covering similar approaches have been using not disclosed data agreement with utilities companies who provide small portions of fine-grained data, but leaving a restricted frameworks to test and apply in other cities. So the accessibility of the data is one of the main challenges that we are facing over here. So what we can do to overcome this problem? So initially, we need to find different ways to get the data that at the level that we needed. So in here, for example, we have several data sources. So we have social economic data, we have environmental, also data infrastructure and urban farm. This has been suggested for University of Princeton and other group working in urban sustainable approaches to have like a comprehensive and transboundary approach. They have been suggested that using these kind of like data source categories, we could have some kind of proxy to compute the energy consumption. But where we can get the data from social economic perspective, like race, income, education, gender, strata, all these basic information that we have at a really fine grade level, we can use it, or we can estimate it using a special micro simulation. The data the environmental data like air temperature, or basically the data that we need for understand the seasonal behavior, we can just use it the traditional data sources that we have access using the rasters, and after that we can extrapolate or extract the values that we needed for the areas that we are wanted to compute. For the infrastructure, we can use the APC, the energy performance certificates, where we have the age of the buildings, stocks, types, energy certification, and all the characteristics of the buildings are already available in these APC data sets. Finally, the urban form, density, shape, and connectivity. So we could also get this data from other public data sources, but there is one interesting approach that we would like to take over here. There is another project in the Turin led by Professor Daniela Rivas-Bell from the University of Liverpool, who provides with a set of polygons or special signatures that describe the UK urban area in terms of shape and functions. So this is one of the interesting approach that we would like to integrate here. So it will be really nice to integrate these data sets into this new dimension to estimate energy use. So the integration of these data sources will provide us with a comprehensive data sets that we can analyze, or we can use to analyze the disparities in three basically dimensions. So we wanted to use this combination of these comprehensive data sets to compute basically three dimensions: the energy use disparities by income initially, but other aspect that we are also interested is to estimate these energy use disparities by ethnicity. Second one is the annual energy use intensity per household. And this is exactly where a special micro simulation is going to take place, because at the moment the data that we have, or at least the data consumption data that we have, is a very general level. So we need to downscale this data to compute per household. Finally, one important aspect, especially in the UK, is the seasonal energy consumption and what kind of disparity we could have with different kind of seasonal comparisons. With this estimation, with these dimensions, we hope we can create a comprehensive inequality landscape in urban energy use that can be used as a baseline. Of course, this is just the first step. We need to have this landscape inequality and then start to create another comparisons. For instance, for example, you wanted to map the current energy efficiency programs affordability, just like the one that I've just mentioned about the heat pumps, the community-wide carbon strategies, the social inequality in terms of energy use with different kind of social demographic dimensions. So this landscape inequality is going to be our baseline. So first of all, we need to fix this problem of this data integration issues, and then create this inequality landscape. And then we have this baseline to compare with other kind of aspects. So this is our road map that we just defined it. As I said, the main challenge that we are facing at the moment is in terms of data. We have requests and download some available data to study the energy demand or use. So we initially wanted to use the energy demand as a proxy to estimate the energy consumptions. So there are three data sets that they are providing the information that we could use for a national level energy use at the fine scale that is required. So the first one is there is a data set available in the Consumer Data Research Center. This is the domestic energy provider, including aggregated statistics as a postcode sectors. So it's basically data that every 30 minutes provide with the electricity meters and the gas meters for the consumption of 2015 in Britain. So it's a really comprehensive data set, and it's basically some data that we can rely on. So we can use that as a parameter to calibrate our initial synthetic population, or this new dimension of the energy use. There is another data set that we can also use, the LSOA level for domestic gas and electricity consumption. As I said, it's a very aggregated level, but we can use that part as one of the elements to downscale the information that we needed. And then there is another one which has been used widely in other kind of studies. The data from energy performance certificates is updated at 2020, but this data set has several kind of issues. Sometimes they have duplicate values, sometimes it doesn't really represent the energy consumption. So we have to deal with these ACP values with care. For example, just a recent study shows that the energy use intensities in London houses shows that this study used 1.2 million of houses in London, and they have proved that the relationship between ACP estimations and the real values from the electricity, at least, they have a really weak correlations. So we have to know how we can use this data as a proxy to estimate the energy consumption, but we have to be aware of these disparities. But it's basically the data that we have access. So we can just use it as a proxy, but we have to obviously take care about how we can integrate it and what kind of conclusion we can get from using this proxy. So once we have the level of energy use intensities, once we have estimated these values, the second step is to compute the Gini coefficients that can be used to quantify the equality. So the Gini coefficients, for those that have no idea what this Gini coefficient assess, is the distribution of resources such as income or in this case accessibility across the population. So and provides an equality scores between 0 and 1, with 0 representing perfectly equal distribution and 1 indicating a completely unequal distribution. So we plan to compute the Gini coefficient as an inequality metric, and the Gini coefficient, as I said, quantifies these dispersions of sample without consideration of social stratification. It focuses on ranking of the data. So the calculation typically based on individual level observation, but we are going to use it obviously in a more aggregated level. So we hope that we can compute this Gini coefficient in terms of MSOA areas, because it's also the fine grade scale that we could get from the synthetic population that we planted to include. And this is not the first time to use these Gini coefficients. This approach has been also studied or applied in other inequality studies on urban energy use in the United States in particular by the University of Princeton in an attempt to get a better understanding of intra-urban inequality in energy use, addressing both income and ethnicity, especially for United States, and where race is one of the aspects that they need to understand what kind of unequal distribution are very distributed in the landscape. So what are our expected results? So basically we have 3 elements, as I mentioned before in this chart. So we wanted to compute the estimation of energy use intensity by defining its scale of the synthetic population, for example, MSOA area. Estimation of the energy use disparity initially by income, and after that by using an ethnicity across the urban areas, and the spatial inequality coefficients. The inequality landscape of the energy use is basically the baseline that we hope we could compute using those integration of the data sources. So where we are at this moment, we are dealing with the data messiness that we have. So as you could see, we have several data sources, all of them with different kind of granularity. So we need to make sure that the granularity or the downscale information that we're going to have is consistent across all the data sources. We need to conclude the estimation or estimation using the special microsimulation for energy use. And this is very exciting for me because this microsimulation has been used for health perspective. There is another project in University of Leeds using the same special microsimulation for energy demand, but we wanted to use it for energy use, which is a little bit more complicated and with a higher risk. And then obviously using the energy use intensity, we are going to compute the inequality dimensions that I just mentioned in the previous slide, starting by the Gini index. And we would like to apply this framework in the West Yorkshire area using as a use case. So before applying for the whole UK, or at least for the whole England, we wanted to start with the West Yorkshire area just to see what kind of response or what kind of landscape we could get. So to finish, I wanted to show you that there is another or similar approach or collaboration that we are also exploring. So there are 3 main collaborations that we are also working on here with Dr. Caitlin Robinson from University of Liverpool, which is she's a very expert working for several years, mapping the special temporalities of energy poverty, vulnerabilities in England. So she is a really expert in how we should map in these spatial temporalities of energy poverty. So I'm very excited to share the ideas with this professor and get all his feedback. There is another Turing fellow also working with us, Dr. Grant Wilson, who is an expert in decarbonations and UK's energy systems. So he really knows how to provide us with that right feedback to understand how we can use the ACP certificates or data sets and the SAP methodology to create this proxy for estimation the energy consumption. So we really need an expert that can tell us how this UK energy system works. And finally, as I said before, Dr. Patricia Ternes of University of Leeds, who is working in a high resolution synthetic population for energy demand. So they are working already in this Spencer model and add this extra dimension for the energy use. So hopefully with these three collaborations, we are going to enhance the current approach. And as I said, my apologies to don't present a final result. As I said, this is the preliminary results, the roadmap that we are taking, and we are still dealing with the data messiness that we have and try to have a comprehensive and consistent framework. But this is basically the idea that we are working over here. We think this idea has a lot of potential, and it's something that currently UK really needs to get a better understanding, especially in this energy crisis that we are having right now with all these like with the different financial supports that they are start to get off of the public sector. So thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed the presentation, and let me know if you have some questions.
Thank you, Fernando, for your presentation. I think we will be taking questions at the end of the session, but a quick reminder also to the audience that you can feel free to leave your questions in the chat and we will address them at the end of the session. So we move forward with the next presentation by Marion Nativel, entitled Integrating Stated Preferences, Landscape Metrics, and Attitudes to Assess Visual Impact of Wind Turbines. So Marion, if you can share your screen. He's in the room. Marion, if you're in the room, if you can you just let me know? Okay, it seems he is in the room, but he isn't available for the moment. Will it be okay? Yeah, he is there. Okay, we can see your screen, but we can't hear you, Mario. We can see the screen, but at least on my side, we have no audio from you. We still have no audio, at least on my side.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now perfectly.
Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Marion. I'm a PhD student at TEMA Laboratory, and my research deals with the assessment of visual impact of wind turbines. The study I will present you today is a research teamwork about the integration of stated preferences, landscape metrics, and attitudes to assess visual impact of wind turbines. I start by providing the background of the research. Then I introduce you the survey, the data collected, and the method used for the statistical analysis. Eventually, I'll show you a piece of the results obtained. So first, why assessing visual impact of wind turbines? Wind farms are developed as a low carbon technology in order to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. In France, national goals are declining regionally and remain ambitious. In Burgundy-Franche-Comté, this little region, the power installed this year consists in 44% of the targets of last year and 28% of the targets purchased by the end of the decade. In one hand, the development of wind farms is still beginning regarding those targets. On the other hand, considering the landscape as an important component of the quality of the living environment, the assessment of visual impact of WT can meet some issues like supporting decision-making process for planning further implementation. Hence, how assessing the visual impact of wind turbines. One way to do it relies on people's stated preferences. To do it, first we constituted a set of 32 photos showing various real WT facilities configurations in the region. So we are in France. The itinerary followed to taken the photos was planned in order to constitute a representative set of the views with WT from the roads from the Burgundy-Franche-Comté. We selected thousands of points along the roads, at least at 7 kilometers from a constructed wind farms. And for these points, some visual landscape metrics were computed with using a Pixscape software. The metrics characterize both the landscape composition, land use, landscape openness, skyline, etc., and wind turbine facility configuration in the landscape view, number, height, distances from the observers, and so on. So a principal component analysis, PCA, has been integrated to a hierarchical cluster analysis in order to categorize those points in 6 clusters. And for each cluster, 10 points were randomly picked out for the first sample and considered as the crossing points to define the itinerary followed for the shooting session. So 90 photos have been taken and 32 out of them have been selected for the final set. The photos have not been touched up, and each of them corresponds with landscape metrics, characterizing both landscape configuration and the presence of wind turbines, number, visual pervasiveness, and so on. And again, we use Pixscape software to compute them. Those photographs are associated to respondents' preferences. The sample completed an online photo-based survey using pairwise comparison, diffused between March and June 2 years ago. Respondents were asked to select the landscape scene they preferred, and then they were also asked about their experience and general attitude toward wind turbine facilities, which allowed us to realize a typology of respondents. So here is the distribution of the respondents in the 2 factorial design computed through multiple correspondence factorial analysis. Here, 17% of the variability is synthesized in this factorial design. The first axis here opposes people against WT in general and people for WT in general. And the second axis opposes people having mixed feelings about it or a clear-cut opinion about WT. So here, people having a clear-cut opinion, and here people with mixed feelings. A third axis could also be defined and characterize the level of involvement for or against wind turbines. Here we have people mostly involved, pro or cons WTs, and here people with very low level of involvement. Finally, when we combine this result to this analysis to HCA, we can define broadly some clusters. Here the WT opponents, here the WT proponents. Here we have pro or con not feeling concerned about WTs, and here pro or con feeling concerned. So the preferences may depend on both characteristics of the landscapes and characteristics of the observers. So we seek to highlight how respondents' attitude toward wind turbine facilities are related to landscape metrics through stated preferences. To do it, we applied, the dataset can be considered as 3 data tables. The one here corresponding, characterizing the respondent according their attitude toward the wind turbines. Let's call it R with my French accent. Here, we have a table describing the 32 photos from 30 visual metrics. Let's call it Q. And we have the 554 stated preferences for the 32 photos here. Let's call it L. To analyze the co-structure of this dataset, we applied a method called RLQ method, developed by Dodelek and other authors in 1996. And to apply this method, we used a R package called ADO4. Basically, the method, to apply the method, we do it in 3 steps. The first step is consists in the multivariate analysis of each dataset, each table. Then we have a co-inertia analysis between LR and QL, and then we analyze the whole structure, RLQ. So step 1, analysis of R, L, and Q. The multivariate analysis allows us to describe the data set. I have already done it with the respondent's profile, and I will do it only with I will talk about the structure of the corpus of photographs here. So when we do a PCA on this data table, we have the distribution of our data set of our photographs according to axes. The first one opposes scenes with diverse linears here. And here, the photos with monocultures. The second axis opposes photographs with high pervasiveness of wind turbines for the positive values and a low pervasiveness of WT in negative values. And that's it. When we have a global idea of how our dataset is constituted, we can analyze the co-inertia, the relationship between the two pairs of our dataset, and the statistical significance of the relationship between RL and QL is evaluated by a random permutation test that tests the independence between the data tables. In practice, this consists of a Monte Carlo test, and the test demonstrates a significant relationship between the stated preferences and the respondent's attitudes, and between the stated preferences and these landscape characteristics here. So we have a significant p-value for both. And this link can be further investigated, which leads to the step 3. As there is a significance relationship, we can go further. And the next step consists of the analysis of the code structure RLQ. Before going further in the interpretation of the results, the same kind of test we did just before allows to evaluate the significance of the relationship between R and Q through L and validate the results of the RLQ analysis. So here we have a significant p-value again for both of them, so we can go further and analyze the results. So the final results consist in the factors that synthesize the code structure of the data tables by maximizing the covariances between RL and QL. To put it differently, the RLQ analysis highlight the dimensions that explains the most part of the variability of the dataset. Here, the first axis correspond to 54% of the total variability, and the second axis corresponds to 20% of the total variability, which means that the analysis allows us to synthesize the data set according to factors. And we can describe the two factors with the characteristics of our R data set and R table and Q table. The first axis of the RLQ analysis considers 90% of the potential projected inertia of the first axis, given by the separate analysis of the table of the Q table. It means that the landscape characteristics have an important weight to explain the variability of the preferences. So here it doesn't work. Why? I don't know. I will show it differently. The first axis of the Q table is that one. We have an opposition between low and high seen with diverse land use and non-diverse land use. And so, and this is the first one of the first group of that explains the variability. Now, if we consider the air table, which corresponds to our respondents' attitude toward wind turbines, we can see that it is not the first axis that explains the variability, but the fourth axis and the second axis. So it is not being for or against wind turbine in general is not a major factor explaining these preferences here. What explains the variability is the fourth dimension of the A table, and this dimension opposes people who thinks that wind turbines have a negative impact on landscape, and people who thinks that wind turbines have not any impact on the landscape. And the second axis opposes people who have a clear-cut opinion on the target and people who have mixed feelings. So that's it. Finally, to sum up, to relate people attitude and the landscape characteristics, we can say that so people think observers who think that WT have a negative impact on landscape have high preferences for things with non-diverse land use and low preferences for things with diverse land use. And it's the contrary for people who think that WT have not an impact on landscape. Then we have a second axis, which is for the LQ, which corresponds to people who have mixed feelings on WT, and they have they state high preferences for low pervasiveness when the scene is characterized by low pervasiveness of WT, and they state low preferences when there is high pervasiveness of WT in the scene, and it's the contrary for people having clear-cut opinion on WT. Finally, to sum up, we propose a method to assess the visual impact of WT from the results of a photo-based survey. And by applying the LQ method on our data, we demonstrated that the visual assessment of WT depends on both the observer's attitude toward WT and the landscape scene characteristics. Thus, both dimensions have to be integrated in the decision-making process that take the visual impact of WT on landscapes in consideration. And furthermore, one of the observer's attributes is having that counts or that have an importance is having mixed feeling or clear-cut opinion on WT rather than being for or against WT. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion, for your presentation. I think we should be moving to the next presentation. First authored by Andrei Korotkov and entitled Wood Trade Region of Russia. So if one of the authors can share his screen.
Yes, we're here. I'm turning on the camera and screen demonstration.
Perfect.
Okay.
yours.
So let me begin. We're a group of researchers from Geographic Faculty of Lomonosov Moscow State University, and today we'd like to present our paper on the topic of wood trade regions of Russia. To begin with, I'll briefly consider the data that we had to give a general idea of what could be done with it. In 2015, in Russia, Unified State Automated Information System was launched. The purpose of the system was to stricter control and regulations in wood industry. All transactions with timber and lumber became a subject to an obligatory declaration, and all traders were made to provide transaction data within 5 days after the deal was made. What's important, a considerable part of this data is open, including sellers and buyers' names, tax identification numbers, deal volumes. However, there is no column for type of traded product, so we had to identify it by ourselves. The data collection process of our project was the following. First, we parsed website of the accounting timber system that I was telling about on the previous slide. Extracting key features, we received Russian enterprises involved in wood trade. Then we used tax identification numbers to send automated requests to Federal Tax Service and received PDF extracts with addresses of registration for legal entities collected from the wood trade page. Finally, we parsed PDF and geocoded addresses to get geographic coordinates for buyers and sellers. The next step was to transform our table with transactions to a graph. Vertices are enterprises. Deals between enterprises are edges, and edge weights are deal volumes. In the picture below, you might see a simplified example of table with deal volumes and a graph. The real graph has around 16,000 vertices and 26,000 edges with approximate total trade volume of 113 million cubic meters. It's in 2020. So we needed to identify clusters in our graph. For that, we used Naidin algorithm based on optimization of modularity. The algorithm still had drawbacks connected with resolution limit. It tends to combine some medium and small clusters into large ones. So to solve this problem, every Naidin created cluster was drawn in abstract space using Futterman-Reingold layout, and then we extracted clusters from layout using min-shift algorithm. Such approach helped us to divide many Naidin created clusters into component parts. Received clusters had the best modularity and isolation degree, and what's even more important, they appeared to be very logical in terms of wood industry. Okay, so after clustering the graph, the results gave the following spatial structure of wood trade. Most of large enterprises by turnover tend to concentrate in Central and Northwest European regions of Russia and in South Siberia around the Baikal Lake. Here we showed only top 30 largest clusters by turnover, and we randomly picked color for each region. As you can see, many clusters fall into existing administrative boundaries of regions of Russia. Also, all clusters have compatible sizes, so no dominant were observed. We calculated isolation degree as a relation of cluster internal turnover to total turnover of clusters enterprises. And all clusters are independent and well separated because its isolation degrees are about 80–90%. All clusters are also compatible in area because their linear size varies up to 800 kilometers, which is approximately equal to maximal wood transportation distance by railroad. After a closer look on the received groups, we identified 5 morphological types of clusters. Vertical monocentric type consists of one large company connected with medium-sized and smaller enterprises. Polycentric, on the right side, is different from monocentric only by number of core companies. Practically all links in vertical clusters are between the main and peripheral enterprises. There are few direct links between peripheral producers in vertical structures. Horizontal clusters in the center of the slide contain well-connected enterprises, which might greatly vary in size. Density of links in such groups is usually very high. In vertical structures, cooperation plays more important role than competition. Peripheral companies mostly interact with 1 or 2 main enterprises, so they don't have very much of choice with which one to cooperate. But in horizontal clusters, the role of competition is as high as the role of cooperation. Smaller enterprises could choose their trade partners among several core companies. Dendritic clusters are linear chains of enterprises subsequently connected to each other. In future, they might become parts of bigger structures. And simple clusters are basically several companies with just a few links. What we also discovered that there seems to be three main clustering factors. Production chains are the case when we observe direct sales between manufacturers. Trade chains are presented in different ways, but always consider indirect sales with intermediaries. In some cases, traders redistribute raw materials within a cluster. In other cases, companies accumulate wood volume for larger enterprises outside the cluster. Sometimes companies trade wood between each other within the cluster, and it actually seems like some kind of speculation. In some clusters, the majority of enterprises might belong to the same holder, so it could be a significant clustering factor as well. It's important to understand that almost every enterprise has their own forest field. On the forest field, trees vary greatly in size and species, and different kind of products require specific kind of wood. For example, you could make plywood only from thicker parts of the tree trunk of deciduous species, and lumber companies use thick logs, mostly of coniferous species. So every industrial enterprise with its own forest fields need to sell unnecessary wood to other manufacturers. From now on, I'll consider some cases to give a better understanding of our empirical findings. Most of clustering methodic are based on specialization and location. In our research, specialization plays a key role in many cases, but location in the same settlement was not a solid argument for clustering. In this slide, you can see two towns in eastern Siberia in which all largest wood industry enterprises are located in different clusters. So there are some cases where geographic proximity doesn't mean connectivity. This is an example of vertical polycentric cluster. The main clustering force is a production chain. The cluster is one of the largest in Russia by inner turnover. It makes up to 9% of all Russian turnover. The cluster links could be visualized as a graph, and the picture on the right side of the slide shows top 10 links by deal volumes, and the picture on the left represents the whole cluster. The color of vertex is an economic activity that we had to define by the codes of economic activity by ourselves. The production chain here is the following. We have Elyutin group, the purple one in the middle of the cluster, which produces pulp and paper, and they have their own forest fields and take thin logs as inputs. It's more economically efficient for them to sell thick logs for lumber. The Elyutin group sells them to Elyutin timber and ULK. It's lumber enterprises marked with a yellow color. Another example of production chain within the cluster is Sveza Novator, which produces plywood. It's marked with a red color. Receives some raw material from logging resource company, Sveza Resource. At the same time, they also return unnecessary thin logs from their forest fields to resource company. And the resource company will redistribute accumulated extra wood all over the Russia. To show an example of horizontal cluster based on trade chains, we have chosen this cluster in northwest European regions of Russia. Trading takes place between companies within the cluster. Wholesale trade and other branch categories make up to 45–50% of inner turnover. You can see on the map that some enterprises form linear structures like here and here and here. And there are trade terminals on of wood trade companies which are situated on the main railroads. As you see, the role of railroad is hard to identify from the graph layout. The cluster has a lot of links, its density is very high, and there are no dominant centers. It's typical horizontal structure. The wholesale wood trade plays the most important role in this cluster, and there are two directions of wood trade. The first is supplies of thick logs to the only plywood producer within the cluster, UPM Menyalschikov. It's marked with a red color. The second is supplies of thin logs to the largest Russian pulp and paper producers outside the cluster. So they can't be seen in a particular graph visualization. The thick logs are being traded with such companies as Elim Group or Mondi or Sigezha. Wholesale wood trade companies collect timber from plenty of small and medium-sized companies within the cluster. And the last case represents a cluster that consists of enterprises which belong to one or several holders. In this particular situation, the owner is Sigezha Group, one of the world leaders of forest industry. Sigezha Group belongs to Russian oligarch Yevtushenkov, and Sigezha evolved from just one pulp and paper company in the 90s to a group of around 50 enterprises in 13 different countries nowadays. Cluster core consists of several enterprises owned by Sigezha. The main one is Sigezhsky CBK, producer of pulp, paper, and carton, and Onezhsky and Sigezhsky LDK and CDOC. They are all producers of lumber. Also, we have LPK Kipelov and Karelian Wood Company, which are logging companies marked with green. So the main enterprise of the cluster is Sigezhsky CBK. It looks like a big spider because Sigezhsky CBK sells thick logs to lumber producers and vice versa gets thin logs from them to use in their own production process. So the second clustering factor in this situation is two types of production chains, pulp and timber. To sum up the results, we developed a new industry clustering methodic based on connections between enterprises. Clusters that we received are interpretable and have well-defined structure, which means that our data was eligible and the results that we received could be considered eligible as well. In many cases, clusters coincide with existing administrative units of Russia. We defined three clustering factors: production chains, trade chains, and holders. But there are still some clusters that don't fit to any of these or combine all of them. Clusters were also divided into 5 morphological types. Vertical, polycentric, and monocentric have low level of competition, and cooperation plays more important role here. Horizontal have both high level of competition and cooperation. Dendritic clusters consist of subsequently connected enterprises and may form bigger structures in future. We mostly have seen such structures in Siberia. And simple clusters they represent just a few enterprises. Finally, in our case study, geographic proximity of enterprises doesn't necessarily come with their connectivity. So neighboring companies could belong to different classes. And also, we're currently working on a project's website, which will make understanding of all interactions between enterprises more intuitive and give a better understanding of what's going on. And all data will be available online as soon as possible, and we will publish the website link in our Twitter account. Thank you for your attention, and we will be glad to answer any questions at the end of the section.
Thank you, Mikhail, for your presentation. I think we move to the last presentation for today, authored by Denisa, Naidin, and Sabine, Dörry, entitled the Luxembourgish Space Industry Evolving Between Local and Global Forces. Naidin, if you can share. Yeah, you can see the screen perfectly. It's yours. Can see the screen, but we cannot hear you.
Yes,
Yeah.
Unmuting myself first is a good idea. Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the session. I hope you can still see my screen.
Yeah, we can. We can see your screen perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So as mentioned, I will be presenting a piece of research that Sabine, Dörry, and I have been working on Luxembourg's space industry, essentially looking at how the industry has been evolving between local and global forces. So why are we talking about this? It might sound surprising considering the fact that Luxembourg is one of the smallest European countries, but it has emerged as a new hub for the space industry over the past 20 years. It's done so in spite of its small size and in spite of its limited industrial base in this sector, which prior to 2000 essentially was represented by SES satellite operator. So has this been the result of industry evolution? So sectoral forces that act globally as the space industry has greatly developed over this period as well globally? Or has it been the effect of local agglomeration dynamics and development at the local level? So it's a question that's really interesting for decision makers because they can then decide on which kind of policies to put in place. But it also coincides with a very interesting academic debate looking at the two lenses that have so far been used to analyze economic evolution. So we've seen people look at the question spatially, looking at things like agglomeration and spillovers, leading an industry down a certain pathway, but also at the sectoral lens, looking at interactions among actors in the same industry, often transcending boundaries, geographical boundaries. So these two perspectives have so far been used mainly in isolation, but there's been a lot of scholars recently that have called for their integration. Unfortunately, so far, the attempts to combine them have only looked at multinational enterprises' corporate structures as potential bridging elements. However, the way the space industry has transformed over the past 20 years, it's gone from an industry concentrated and dominated by essentially a handful of giant global companies to a more diverse, more cross-sectoral sector, including a lot of very mobile and born global SMEs. So if having this M&E-based structure, you might not see the full picture, both in terms of the spatial structures, but also from the sectoral perspective. So this research is actually building innovation networks from data on collaborative research and development, collaborations in the space sector. And in order to explore this tension between the local context and what's happening globally within the industry, we look at these innovation networks and their evolution, both spatially, so looking at how things are happening on the ground, and sectorally, so looking at international connectivity. We focus on Luxembourg, which is our geographical anchor, but we also take into account global collaborations that organizations in Luxembourg might have. And we focus on the space sector, but including also collaborators from other sectors. So in order to do so, we use data from funded projects from the European Union and European Space Agency, as well as data from the Luxembourg Space Agency to build this network. We end up with 472 organizations. 77 of them are based in Luxembourg, and the rest are essentially their global collaborators. And it's based on 106 joint collaborative research and development projects that include at least one commercial partner, because we're focusing on innovation understood as bringing new knowledge into real life products and services, and at least one organization based in Luxembourg, which is our geographical anchor. And this is what our network, sectoral network looks like. So every point on this represents an organization, and the links between them represent joint participation in CR&D projects. The weight of these links represent how many joint projects they've done together. The red dots and the red writing represent organizations based in Luxembourg, whereas the blue ones represent foreign, global, mostly European collaborators on these projects. So it's instantly interesting to see SES, which is the legacy actor, the large Luxembourgish company that was here beforehand, at the center of the network. And it's also interesting to see this large cloud of unconnected or poorly connected companies essentially gravitating around the connected companies inside. So as I mentioned, we're looking at it from an evolutionary point of view. So we're looking at how this has changed. What's instantly visible on this graph, where we bunch years together by periods of 4, is how SES, which is this point over here, has slowly but surely moved towards a central position. So in the beginning, as I mentioned before 2000, there wasn't much. There weren't that many Luxembourgish organizations involved in space. Most of them were disconnected. SES was the only one there, but even it, although this is a Luxembourg tethered innovation network, you can see that even SES is fairly marginal when you consider the network. It has slowly moved towards the central of the network and developed very strong collaborations with a few organizations. But what's interesting to see is that you do see an evolution in terms of the density of the network, but also in the amount of red, which is the Luxembourg-based organizations. So there is this self-reinforcing central role for the legacy actor and also for other large organizations involved in space that join. So for example, this point over here that slowly migrates to the center as well is LuxSpace, which is an OHB company. So essentially, it's one of the competitors of SES that has also progressed since its incorporation, has slowly progressed towards a center position. But all of these actors, so large-scale, fairly central Luxembourgish actors, actually owe their central position in the network to collaborations globally. So to sectoral industry connections to global actors. And marginalized local businesses, so most of the Luxembourgish smaller, let's say, or not as specialized in space businesses, they essentially have two options for integrating themselves into the network. They either build their own foreign networks, so they join via foreign connections into this innovation network, or they connect into essentially the few central points of the network, one of which is SES, but from 2015 also the University of Luxembourg, which you can see here. So newly incorporated companies, as you've seen on the previous slide, tend to be heavily disconnected. Most of these are actually newly incorporated. And they're heavily disconnected both locally, so from local sources, but also from international organizations, which obviously causes their isolation. It's also because the support system in Luxembourg is not very thick. It's fairly thin. So if you look at the detail, for example, SES connects heavily to organizations such as DLR, TNO, Fraunhofer, which are German or Dutch, or the CNRS or the CNES, so French networking sources and knowledge sources, rather than connecting into the local equivalent, which is LIST. So it's quite an interesting view of how the support system kind of fails some of the actors. Connected businesses are more often locally owned. Actually, in Luxembourg, 78% of the connected local businesses are locally owned, and foreign-owned businesses, locally incorporated businesses, are actually most disconnected. So around 62% of foreign-owned local branches are disconnected, which kind of hints at the fact that they still rely on international corporate structure for their innovation and don't actually join up with the local innovation system. Looking at the Luxembourgish businesses themselves, so all of the organizations incorporated in Luxembourg, it's really interesting to see that 86% of links, so So 86% of connections between organizations based in Luxembourg actually happen in the last 5 years of our analyzed period, so between 2015 and 2020. And it mostly happens between relatively old organizations, so well-established organizations. Most of them are actually incorporated before the year 2000, but they have waited until 2015 to 2020 to actually connect. And this period coincides with that peak in incorporations. So it's during this period, 2015, 2020, that you also see this peak of incorporations in Luxembourg. However, it's hard to draw any clear conclusion about the sectoral structural transformations in Luxembourg, and this peak of incorporation and collaboration, because the structure of the sector, while it has been slowly adding members and slowly adding networking facilities or facilitators, such as the University of Luxembourg or LIST, which is one of the local innovation institutes. These structures don't really explain this huge peak of both incorporations and collaborations happening in 2015-2020. So now looking more towards the spatial structure of these innovation networks. Traditionally, Luxembourg space was mainly connected to, let's say, established space nations. So nations or countries that already had really well-established space programs, large space businesses, such as Germany, France, the United Kingdom. So that was traditional. In recent periods, and especially again in this period 2015-2020, some of these connections have lost weight in favor of emerging new space nations such as Belgium, the Netherlands, or Switzerland. So these are also smaller countries that have emerged on the global scale scene as new hotspots for the space industry's startups mainly. So it's quite an interesting development to see that Luxembourg is now establishing more connections to countries that are behaving similarly from this point of view. Now, looking at organizations based in Luxembourg, depending on when they appear, so when they're incorporated, you do see a move away from peri-urban areas towards more urbanized areas, which is in line with what the literature says about highly complex industry. And these concentrations, so you see points of concentration in 3 places in Luxembourg. These concentrations are built through an accumulation, longer temporal accumulation of players. So none of them is like all of a sudden appearing on the map. These clusters appear to contain members of all ages or a wide variety of ages. So they've been slowly accumulating experience locally. So nationally, there appears to be 3 clusters that interestingly also represent 3 cluster typologies. So the first one appears around the SES headquarters. So SES, again, is the legacy actor in this industry. Let's say the representative of established space. And the cluster grows through the gradual addition of competitors, such as OHB, through the addition of collaborators, such as Adwawes, and the move there of companies they acquire. The second cluster is based around the university, this innovation hub built by Technoport, and it grows through spin-outs, startups, and the landing pad services that the Technoport incubator offers to foreign, mostly SMEs. The third cluster is quite an interesting mix of things. It's built around the capital city and grows with the addition of bank incubators and their spinouts. It grows around access to financing, but also proximity to government organizations that get involved in space. However, although there's physical clusters forming, so organizations decide to co-locate, these clusters don't seem to be encouraging collaborative research and development, because companies or organizations that are part of these clusters tend to connect mostly outwards rather than inwards. So they would rather go to other clusters and work with organizations in other clusters than with organizations based in their own cluster. So it's quite an interesting thing to consider. They probably cluster in order to share resources and to take advantage of pools of specialized labor, for example. But apparently the agglomeration dynamics don't really count as much for when it comes to collaborative innovation. In any case, when you see the bigger picture, collaborative innovation is driven by international connectivity in Luxembourg. And most of these actors, although they might connect to a few local actors, they mostly connect internationally to the sector. So the sector does prime, in this case, over agglomeration or spatial dynamics. Although global players do remain important in the innovation network, the national level does gain traction in the period 2015 and 2020. And the magnitude of this shift it's hard to explain by sectoral and spatial changes. So even if we account for the increased number of players or active in the network by the increased number of networking actors, and even if we take into account spatial structures, so for example, the establishment of incubators in Belval or the capital, you can't really explain the magnitude of the change during this 5-year period. So one potential explanation for this is the implementation of a number of national policies, mostly legal changes that target the space industry. And that is something that we are planning on exploring next. So thank you for your attention, and I will be sharing this presentation if you're interested in the references for this. So I think now is the time for questions.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Definitely it's time for questions. We maybe have 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So please feel free to leave your question in the chat or just to unmute yourself and ask the question. If you have a question, please go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
For Denisa. I was wondering how come Deloitte is in your graph related to the space industry? Do you have any idea? Do they have like a research and development department that is investing in space in Luxembourg?
Yes, so actually, even at European level, Deloitte and Capgemini are, let's say, the consultancies that are most involved with the space sector. PwC also has a dedicated sector, and it's because it's one of the up and coming and highest growth sectors in European economy, in the European economy. So it has an annual growth rate of over 8%. Some of these consultancies have set up specialized departments working on these technologies and advising manufacturers and even non-space entities on how to take advantage of these technologies. So Deloitte, for example, is in the graph because they have collaborated, amongst others, with SES on how to develop some of the space technologies for their users.
Thanks.
Thank you for this. Any more questions?
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
I have a question for Mikhail. So first of all, congratulations on your research. It was a very interesting presentation. My question is whether you plan or like whether you see like possible practical implications of the analysis that was very well done and defined in terms of like whether you see perspectives in terms of policy recommendations or a production optimization or, you know, like stuff like this, business model optimization.
Yeah, we think that getting an idea about absence of several clusters or some cluster structure could be useful for some governmental support for cluster in industries. For example, if in forest industry, government decides to develop some or to support producers, they might be use the results of our research to get a better understanding of how it's connected and how producers interact with each other. And I think that we will be happy to share our results if anyone will need it. So
thank you.
Thank you for this. I think we can take a couple of more questions if any are raised. If not, maybe I can have a question to Marion. You did mention that you have 30 landscape metrics that I think are generated through big space, if I did get that correctly. I was wondering, like, what is the criteria of selecting these metrics, or how they were generated in a way? If you can elaborate on that, that would be great.
Sorry, I didn't hear well.
Yeah, I'll speak louder. I'm sorry for this, because I'm in a lecture room, basically. So you did mention that you have 30 landscape metrics that you're using that are, I think, generated through big space, if my memory serves me right. So I was wondering, what is the selection criteria for these specific 30 metrics? How did you generate those and select these specific 30 metrics? Or are they based on the 32 images that you have for the turbines?
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think it's a connection problem because I don't hear very well, but I think I could get the question.
I can write it down.
I will try to answer.
I will write it down.
Yeah.
The chat.
The metrics I was talking about were computed using a software developed in the laboratory, and there are several metrics. We have a first group of metrics that can describe the composition of the landscape, the land use, the openness, the skyline, and so on. Then we have some metric that describe the configuration of the landscape, and according to the wind turbines, we can have the number of wind turbines that can be seen in a view window, and the height, the distance from the observers. So different distances, the distance of the wind turbine, which is the closest to the observer, or the far west. And we also have an indicator that measures the, I don't know how to put it in English. Let me try to find. Yeah, the angular height, accumulated angular height that can give us an indication of the pervasiveness of the wind turbine. It takes in account the number of turbines that can be visible, and the surface, the surface in the view window. To compute it, we need we use some GIS support. We have we need sorry, I know the technical terms in French.
Right. Like my question was, how did you, if they're using some kind of GIS based maps, were there criteria for selecting these maps, or
we need three kind of maps. The first one is the land use, a model which describes the land use. The second one is describe the elevation for each land use part, zone, area, and MNT. And an MNT.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think we can have one more question. We have 3 more minutes to go. I think we can have one more question if there are any raised. I mean, if not, maybe I would just go on and have a very quick question to Fernando, I think, or just sort of an elaboration. I might have missed it in his presentation. If he's still around, that would be great. With the energy use model, micro simulation model that you're planning to do, I know you're working with a lot of data sets, and I might have missed that you're working with it. So in terms of energy use, are you looking at it as a sort of an overall value, or are you sort of subdividing it into electricity, for instance, and gas, and so on and so forth? As far as I know, in the UK, you still have households that use gas, for instance, and use electricity and so on. So can the model sort of differentiate between those aspects, or are they dealt with as one?
Well, once you start to get the data from the special micro simulation, you need to combine both approaches. And once you combine both approaches, then you have to evaluate the calibration of the model. So we need to find a baseline to calibrate both aspects. So when we talk about energy, we are talking about the combined approach, electricity and gas. And based on another previous research, it seems that the gas has a little bit more correlationship between the ACP values and the real values. But even though we need to calibrate it using some kind of proxy parameters, and the ones that we have is the ACP, but the ACP has several issues in terms of the quality of the estimations. But the other one that we have is a CDRC dataset that provides us with the electricity and gas measures from the meters. So we actually have real data. The only issue with that is aggregated at the postcode level, but this is still quite enough to do it in terms of the granularity that we are expecting to do it. So yes, just to reply to your questions, is a combined approach, and after this combined approach, we need to calibrate the model in both aspects, in gas and electricity.
Thank you for this.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think we're almost at the end of the session. Thank you all for your presentations. Thank you for your interest and for sticking around until the end of the day. Thanks for for some fantastic presentations, and thank you for a lot of interesting discussions so far. And just a quick note by the end of the session, just a reminder that this session was recorded. So please, if you wish that your presentation is not published on our YouTube pages or YouTube channels, just please let us know and we will abide to that if needed. Thank you again, and I hope we will see you tomorrow in the next sessions, which starts at 9 a.m. I think. Yeah, it starts at 9 a.m. Thank you again, and I hope you have a good evening, a good day.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.
Everyone, have a good evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.